There are very important questions on how one deals with the nation's drug problem. Does one continue to deal with it through the criminal justice system? I can at least tell you that having chaired a special committee of the ABA very recently, where we went around the country talking to not members of the Civil Liberties Union, but police chiefs, prosecutors, and judges, we were told by those who are on the front line of fighting the drug problem that it was an impossible fight in the criminal justice system. And they added, and I'm talking about a very large sample of police chiefs and prosecutors in this country in every state, that even if they were given all the resources that the Congress or the state legislatures wanted to give them, they cannot deal with it in the criminal justice system. It's a frustrating, failing job. It isn't that they don't make thousands of arrests, they do. But the thousands of arrests completely jam the courts, jam the prisons, distort and overwhelm the criminal justice system, and whereas they destroy the opportunity of the criminal justice system to be effective, they do nothing, all of these thousands of arrests, to in any way affect the drug trade or drug use. It has been a very frustrating responsibility of the police, and they feel that the public feel they can solve it. What they told us is they can't. Our two speakers, and those are the things I think we want to listen to today and see whether or not getting tough on drugs, as if we haven't been tough already, is the answer, or are there other answers? As I say, to many people, it's an insoluble problem. Our two speakers, I think, can add quite a bit of light. Senator Joseph Biden is chairman, as we all know, of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and has been one of the leading members of the Senate in crime legislation. He, in 1982, was the chief architect of major bipartisan crime legislation passed by the Congress. And even though it was vetoed by the President, it was resubmitted and enacted in 1984. And it has been considered the most significant reform of federal criminal code ever enacted. He also played a key role in the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, and also was a very important person in the effort to get legislation through that would create the important role of the drug czar. Senator Biden also has been before this audience at Georgetown on other occasions, and we all know him as a senator of integrity, as a leader in the Senate, and in his own right, as someone who has taken very seriously the problem of crime in America. Eric Sterling heads up a very interesting organization called the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, which is attempting to take a fresh look at criminal justice problems, and particularly now the drug problem, and to inform the public of the truth concerning these matters rather than the myths that so much the public hears. He too, by the way, has had an important and significant legislative experience in the House of Representatives, serving our own Robert Drinan, when Drinan was a congressman, in various crime legislation, and also Congressman William Hughes, who chaired the subcommittee on crime. So he too has quite a bit of insight and understanding not only of the crime problem in America, but the very difficult problems of legislating in that area. So without more introduction or statement, I think we ought to begin to hear what our two speakers have to say about it, and it is a great honor that I call upon Senator Joseph Biden to begin.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I might add, it's my honor to be on a panel that you are moderating. I might also suggest to you at the outset that I suffer from a serious disability. I had it defined for me by the neurosurgeon who spoke to me at Walter Reed between operations, when he was trying to explain to me what an aneurysm was and how aneurysms occurred, two of which I was suffering from, one having just been corrected. And he was talking about them being congenital. And I said, well, then the second operation is going to be no problem. And he was very frustrated that I wouldn't take seriously the second operation. And he said to me out of frustration, and I quote, "The problem with you, Biden, is you are a congenital optimist." And that is probably the appropriate way for me to begin, by acknowledging that I am a congenital optimist. I do believe that we can make significant progress on the drug problem in America and, quite frankly, in the world. It is not, it has no single locus. We happen to be concerned about it here. But I do believe we can make significant progress if we are a good deal brighter, more committed, and willing to commit all at one time a series of different types of resources to deal with the problem. I do not share, as a momentary disclaimer here, the view of our moderator that the war on poverty was a failure. I would point to the fact that more senior citizens in America are living in good health and out of poverty than any time in the history of the United States of America. I would point that there are some changes. There's still serious poverty, but we have made progress. And I suggest to you that it's very possible to make a considerable amount of progress with regard to the problem of drugs. Now let me, as briefly as I can, those of you who have witnessed oral argument before the Supreme Court know that about every lawyer, if they know what they're doing, when they stand before the court, tries as quickly, as rapidly, as concisely to get their major arguments out, principal arguments out, for fear of being interrupted by one of those stately women or men on the bench with a question that may be anything from on point to inane, and may, at a minimum, cause a discontinuity in the argument being made. And so I will try to get straight to the point. And that is that the premise from which I began is that the reason why we have not made more progress is we have failed to view the various dimensions of the drug problem as a single problem. We have somewhere in excess of 10 million people in America who are addicted, by definition of the National Institute, or the NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, to a minimum of 6 million Americans. And their definition is basically, to use layman's terms, someone who is psychologically or physiologically addicted so that they're incapable on their own to reasonably be expected to stop consuming whatever the drug is they're consuming. And we know that we have an extreme shortage of actual medical help available to those who are contemplating the use of drugs, who are casual users and are fearful that they will move beyond that, and or those who are addicted. We know at this very moment, notwithstanding the President's assertion or Mr. Bennett's assertion that the reason why we have to get tough on casual users is to push them into treatment. Well, we already have, by count as recently as last month, 55,000 Americans who have already raised their hands, put their names on a list with some bureaucracy in one of the 50 states or territories of the United States and said, "I need help," and are incapable of having that help made available to them. We know further that during the beginning of the last administration, when the focus shifted on drugs, that in the early 80s, we essentially denuded the professional population available to intelligently treat and or give guidance on the whole consumption side of the equation. And we also know that there has been a stark decline in the number of casual users without anyone doing anything other than what's been done the last dozen years. We also know that the number of those who you would consider addicted, or those who use a controlled substance at a minimum once a week, has climbed during this same period of time. And there's a lot of other things that we know that I will not bore you with at the moment. But the reason I cite some of those things is to make the following assertion. Up to now, presidents and governors and congresspersons have decided that either A, the way to wage the war on drugs is to interdict all drugs coming into the country, put the bulk of your resources there. If you just stop them at the source, you'll stop the problem. There are those who have argued that we should treat this as a mental disease, therefore we should beef up the treatment and prevention side and not worry so much about the enforcement side of the equation or the interdiction portion of the equation. And we debate back and forth, but never once have we, as a nation, to the best of my knowledge, nor has any community, to the best of my knowledge, invested resources in both prevention, education, treatment, and enforcement, making the criminal justice system function, whether it should or should not function, function the way it was designed to function. Never have we attempted in any coordinated way to use our imaginations to deal with the fundamental problems in source countries, which is basically raw economics. The reason why people in Bolivia grow coca leaf is even when the coffee agreement was in place, they could make $600 a year growing coffee, and growing a coca crop, they could make $1,000 a year growing a coca crop. We have never attempted to coordinate the various arms and the hydra-headed government that we have. So at this very day, while we're talking about helping Colombia, quote unquote, we have refused, we are the reason for the breakdown in the coffee agreement, which is the source of Colombia's economic base and power economically, causing the price of coffee to plummet by over 60%, at a minimum 40%, while we're sending $340 million in aid to Colombia, which does not cover 1/10, probably 1/50th of the lost revenue, because the coffee agreement, because of us, is no longer in effect. So, to overstate it in the interest of time, we have not very well coordinated, ever, the various aspects of the problem that I think if we did, we would be able to make some significant changes in not only habits, the degree of desire to consume in this country, but also in the organizations that are responsible for the dissemination of the majority of the product consumed. And I might add, before my friend, and as we say in the Senate, and he is my friend, as a matter of fact, was incidentally one of my, quote, advisors, because we worked on the crime bill. He worked for Congressman Hughes, and Hughes has been a point person on the House side, and I was on the Senate side, so we worked together off and on over the years, and I have great respect for Mr. Sterling. But in the interest of getting to what will be probably the most controversial and interesting part of this discussion, let me go right to the issue of whether or not we could reach the conclusion that A, the war, and I never call it a war because I'm just settled for a few battles being won, let alone a war, but whether the war on drugs should be declared a failure and conclude from that that there is no reasonable way to wage that war other than to move directly to legalizing or decriminalizing. And there's various definitions. I don't mean in any way to characterize Mr. Sterling's position here, because you will hear people make arguments with regard to the legalization of some, all, a few of the drugs that are controlled substances in control category number 1 and 2. You will hear people say that we want to legalize only to the extent that the medical profession will be able to maintain on the drug of choice of a particular addict, but not make it available to the larger population. You will hear people argue that we should in fact legalize it in the sense that we have legalized liquor and have controlled outlets through which you will be able to buy that drug, whatever the drug is that we're talking about legalizing. So please keep in mind, for the next 10 minutes or so, I am not characterizing Mr. Sterling's argument, because I don't know precisely what his argument is. But I'm going to speak to the argument made by famous television personalities and yachtsmen like William Buckley and hard-working mayors like the mayor of Baltimore, conservatives and liberals, college professionals and trial lawyers, young people and old people who've begun to press the legalization case. At George Mason University last week, several students and one very articulate young libertarian, and I mean that sincerely, argued strongly the legalization case. And as I go into my reasons for disagreeing with legalization and why I oppose it, I want to make it clear I do not view it as some wild notion that only irrational persons could come up with. It has some very, very strong points to argue for it. But I think on balance, the case against legalization is overwhelming from this senator's standpoint. I guess you would all expect nothing other than that. You doubt whether you'd expect me as a public official, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, up for re-election, coming arguing legalization. But as one of my former colleagues said, it's great when conscience and convenience cross paths in politics. In this case, they do. I happen to strongly disagree with the legalization argument, and it also is, from a political standpoint, a wiser course for me to take, Mr. Dash. But all kidding aside, I do think the arguments against it are strong. The folly of legalization, in my view, can be demonstrated by considering at least some of the major arguments that are put forward for legalization. The central purpose of legalization of drugs is to lower the street price of those drugs. Everything else legalization is supposed to gain for society stems from this one effect: lowering the price. When legally approved entities sell drugs, they will do so at much lower prices than currently occurs, because the risks of the business have been eliminated from the process. When buyers have to pay less for a gram of coke, they'll engage in less crime to earn the money they need to buy those drugs. In sum, legalization takes the drug trade out of the hands of the professional criminals, so the argument goes, and by lowering price reduces the need for addicts to commit crimes to fund their habits. And I'll come back in a minute to challenge whether or not, in fact, legalization causes prices to fall significantly and would eliminate black markets. But first, I want to identify the number one problem caused by legalization. And it's a problem that honest legalization advocates admit, at least in the literature that I have read. And this is that if we legalize drugs, more people will consume drugs. That in and of itself is not an argument against legalization, but let me state it again. If we legalize drugs, more people will consume drugs than now consume drugs. More people will take them because they will be cheap and they'll be affordable. More people will take them because the argument that drug education and prevention people make against drugs will be a little more difficult to make now that the moral imperative against the use of drugs has been lifted, and there is no legitimate argument that can be made about whether or not there is anything other than the question of whether you can afford it and like it and makes you feel good and does or does not do damage to your body. Legalization advocates know this, and in the words of one such advocate, I guess he's become the House professor, leading House professor for the argument, who was one of my advisors on other matters, by the way, I hope he's not into another losing cause like he was in my presidential effort. But Professor Nadelman of Princeton argues, and I quote, "Even with strict controls, legalization would almost certainly increase the availability of drugs, decrease their price, and remove the deterrent power of a criminal sanction, all of which may well invite increased use and abuse." End of quote. The second huge problem with legalization follows from the increased drug use, and that is legalization will increase the number of drug addicts in America. And this is a pure and simple function of chemistry. Cocaine and heroin are chemically addictive. They alter the state of the mind, and they, in fact, have an impact upon one's ability to conclude whether or not they wish to try such a drug again. Although I might tell you, you have to, in fact, acquire an appetite for heroin. It doesn't come easy, as most people think it does. Not everyone who takes these drugs becomes an addict, but a significant number do, and the larger the pool of drug takers, the larger the number of addicts. Legalization advocates are understandably reluctant to acknowledge this point. And I believe it's immoral to urge a public policy that leads people to addiction, which, after all, is a condition of slavery. They are not capable of controlling themselves. And because legalization advocates are decent, moral people, they cannot admit this consequence of the policy they pursue. At least those which I've discussed this issue with in the past are reluctant to admit it. And I am assigning my reason as to why I think they are. Legalization proponents try to avoid this addiction vice by suggesting that it is readily possible to be a casual drug user. Now keep in mind, you have to make that assumption. You have to assume that you are able to be a casual drug user, and I know none of you know anybody who's used drugs because this is Georgetown and you needed a 3.8 to get in here. But some of us who had 2 3.6s in undergraduate school knew people who used drugs. The fact of the matter is that how many times have you heard, okay, 5 minutes, how many times have you heard the argument that, no, don't worry, I can control it. I can handle this. Now, the risks of addiction are increased with time. They increase with consumption. And as my colleague will point out to you, and we can argue, they differ depending on the drug one takes. But they chemically alter the chemistry of the brain. They impact upon one's desire. They impact upon one's need. They impact upon one's ability to control consumption. Let me say at this moment, since my time is almost up, that it is in fact, arguably, and I would assert it, easier to assert that one could be a casual consumer of liquor without becoming an abuser of liquor than it is that one can be a casual consumer of heroin, a casual consumer of cocaine, and they're usually the two drugs we talk most about, and marijuana as well, I might add. Because I don't know anybody who's arguing that we should legalize angel dust. I don't know anybody who's arguing we should legalize crack. I don't know anybody who's arguing we should legalize ice. I don't know anyone arguing that we should legalize PCPs. I don't know anyone who's making that argument. Usually you'll hear the argument discussed in terms of cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. And my view is that if a society, and I'm going to short circuit the rest of this because my time is up, if a society makes a judgment that we know beforehand that there is an overwhelming prospect that by legalizing a substance it's going to increase consumption and will significantly, geometrically increase the pool of those who will become addicted to that substance, then it seems to me as a society we are copping out on what is ultimately a moral obligation of a government to attempt to, unless you take a totally libertarian view, that, and the argument I will get into, by the way, in response here, I hope, is that this notion that it only hurts the person who's consuming. I will argue in the rebuttal here, if we have an opportunity, that the cost of legalization in terms of medical health care bills will be at least as significant as the costs of society in attempting to deal with prevention of consumption. That it will, in fact, have that phenomenal. This woman is having a terrible problem. I'm causing her to cause her face to be contorted, so I'll sit down here in a minute to give her a chance to ask the questions. But the point that I want to conclude with is, the point that I'd like to conclude with is that we have not won because we have not waged the fight intelligently. And to legalize would be to capitulate and would cause greater damage to society, to individuals within society, and greater cost to society than attempting to deal with the system as it is now by changing the way in which we allocate our resources and time.
Thank you, Senator Biden. You certainly will have an opportunity to add additional thoughts, somewhat in rebuttal, and of course to answer questions. Before calling on Eric Sterling, I just am tempted to repeat a comment I heard from the former Surgeon General, who was speaking about, and he wasn't directing anything towards you, he was speaking about our administration's hypocrisy of arguing that against Colombia sending cocaine to the United States, and our countries exporting to third world countries nicotine, tobacco, and drew this kind of comparison when one talks about harm. Apparently, according to his figures, there are 136,000 deaths caused by tobacco, whereas cocaine causes about 3,000 deaths, and the consistency or lack of consistency of our country's policies are significant. But in any event, I call now, with pleasure, Eric Sterling, President of the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, to present his bizarre views on legalization.
Professor Dash, thank you very much. It is, I'd like to thank first Steve Nesmith, President of the Student Bar Association of this Law Center, for his very hard work and diligence in putting together this afternoon's program. He spent many hours making the arrangements, and I want to acknowledge his work and his courtesies to me and my staff. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm just delighted to be here. I also want to commend Senator Biden for freeing so much of his time to come here today to discuss on a very serious, thoughtful basis these very important issues. You don't know how rare and how much of a pleasure it is to be on a platform with Senator Biden to discuss these issues, because in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, Congress made a couple of points about what we're doing right now. Section 501 of that act, the Congress finds that legalization of illegal drugs on the federal or state level is an unconscionable surrender in a war in which, for the future of our country and the lives of our children, there can be no substitute for total victory. At Section 5011 of Subtitle A called Opposition to Legalization and Public Awareness. In the same bill, Public Law 100-690, November 18, 1988, Subtitle F of a different title, Title 6, sense of Congress that proposals to legalize illicit drugs should be rejected. Section 6201, it is the sense of Congress that 1, proposals to combat sale and use of illegal drugs by legalization should be rejected, and 2, consideration should be given only to proposals to attack directly the supply of and demand for illicit drugs, such as proposals to strengthen and expand penalties for sale and use, proposals to encourage greater multinational cooperation in eradication and interdiction, and proposals to promote educational awareness programs for young people. Now, I bring this up because if we were here, let's say, debating the MX missile, or better yet, the Challenger, if Congress had put in the legislation, we shall not discuss the question of whether or not the moon is made of green cheese, we would say, now, what's Congress getting at? They don't have to do that. They don't have to say that the moon is not made of green cheese and we can't talk about it. Or if we were discussing the Navy appropriation, we wouldn't have to have legislation saying that nobody shall discuss the idea that ships will fall off the edge of the earth if the aircraft carriers sail beyond the 12-mile limit. I mean, that would be ludicrous. And yet Congress, in 2 places in the Drug Act, said we shouldn't even talk about this issue. And so I want to commend the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee for taking very seriously these issues, and he has raised and made a number of excellent points. What I'd like to do first is to just discuss the question of what should be our goals. What is our national drug policy goal? How many of you think it's a drug-free America? Sounds good, a drug-free America. It's a great slogan. And I think probably we know at least a dozen public relations firms downtown that tell their clients that their senior partner thought up that term and sold it to Nancy Reagan. But the problem is slogans don't work as goals. The most important thing about a goal is that you can achieve it. It's an objective that enables you to measure your performance. Now, I suggest that we be honest and concede that there will always be drugs, that we can't make drugs disappear. We can't create a worldwide amnesia, forget that they're drugs. People use drugs because drugs work, and lots of people like the way that drugs work. When you go home tonight after your studies and you're watching television, how many of you think you'll see the ad which has the following jingle? I don't have time for the pain. What is that they are selling but drugs? It is not a coincidence that Americans are the greatest consumers of legal drugs as well as illegal drugs in the world. Let me propose a goal, and that is to reduce the harm to individuals and the society from the fact that there are people who use drugs. In other words, given the real world, how can we reduce the harms from drug use and drug trafficking? Because when we quantify the harms, we can use this approach to set specific objectives for minimizing harm. Another way to look at this, let's say, is to call it drug harm management. Let's compare this issue to another major national problem, air pollution and acid rain. A practical public servant doesn't say, our goal is a pollution-free America. A governor or a president does not announce, we're going to have zero tolerance for carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide emissions. We all want clean air, but a wise and skillful public servant would figure out how to minimize the problems surrounding pollution and how to minimize the most harmful types of pollution. To achieve cleaner air, we're not going to make it a crime to drive a car, a crime to burn wood in the fireplace, or a crime to turn on the electricity. But if we said that our goal must be zero tolerance for air pollution, then the enactment of new crimes like that would be necessary ingredients, and such draconian measures would be the foundation of a war approach to solving the problem of pollution. What I suggest is that this afternoon, instead of thinking in terms of a war on drugs, which implies that someone or some party will be vanquished, or that people have to be killed to achieve victory, let's think about managing the drug problem to reduce the harms that it causes. I'm going to urge this afternoon that we regulate and police the market in drugs, what in shorthand these days is called legalization. But instead of thinking in terms of drug legalization, which conjures up the images of Spuds MacKenzie advertising cocaine on television and crack vending machines in the lobby of the hotel across the street, let's think again in terms of drug problem management or drug harm management. And let's not confuse our goals with our means. As we discuss how to get out of the terrible problems that drug abuse, drug trafficking, and drug enforcement are causing our society, let's keep minimizing harm from drugs in mind and set aside unachievable goals like zero tolerance or slogans like drug-free America. want to note parenthetically at this point that Professor Dash mentioned tobacco, and I want to commend Senator Biden again because he has forcefully and repeatedly stated that alcohol and tobacco use are among our nation's drug problems, and he has had the very singular honesty to put forth a proposal to discourage the abuse of tobacco by taxing those drugs more heavily. I think that he's absolutely right on target on this point, but unfortunately the President, in his war on drugs, has not identified such measures. Let me identify for a moment a dozen of the kinds of harms that I think we want to see reduced. Number one, we don't want to see drugs being sold to children. Number two, children selling drugs. Number three, the killing of children and others in the drug marketplace, either deliberately or as the result of an accidental stray shot in a shootout. Fourth, kids going to hospitals or to morgues with overdoses from drug abuse. Fifth, kids being abandoned or abused by their parents because their parents are using drugs. Sixth, kids being harmed before birth by their mother's abuse of drugs. Seventh, kids engaging in crime to get the money to buy drugs. Each of those are 7 serious and distinct problems that deal with children. But there are others. The eighth, for example, is scarce capital leaves our communities and goes overseas to make the drug lords rich. 9, AIDS is being spread by the sharing of needles and the prostitution involved in getting money to buy drugs. 10, we're losing our civil liberties. As the police get permission to get tough on inner-city drug traffickers, they begin to indiscriminately stop and search people just walking down the street. Losing our constitutional rights is a very real harm. Our parents and our ancestors fought and in many cases died to preserve those rights, and we should not be willing to see them given up. 11, everybody's insurance premiums are higher because drug-related theft is responsible for extensive insurance claims. 12, the medical care system that serves all of us is being overwhelmed by drug violence and drug-related disease. Now, under the approach of managing harm, of reducing harm, we look at each of those harms and seize what contributes to them and what steps might reduce their harmfulness. For each of those 12 harms, I think we'll find at least one common element, and that is the criminal nature of the illegal drug traffic. It is the prohibition against any legal manufacture, sale, or use of these drugs that aggravates every one of those harms. There's an important historical point to consider. Many variations of these harms were problems with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s and early 1930s. Children were selling booze. Children were killed in the crossfires of gangster shootouts. Corruption was rampant. Gangsters like Al Capone controlled entire cities. Police, prosecutors, judges, and legislators were all on the payroll of criminals. Alcohol prohibition and the current situation in Colombia are the best models for predicting the future of a war on drugs. Now let me switch to an overview of the President's national drug strategy and why I don't think it will work. The federal government has essentially 5 elements of a war on drugs strategy. The first is to eradicate the drug crops grown in source countries. The second is to interdict the supply lines of drugs as they're being shipped into the country. The third is to investigate, prosecute, and arrest the traffickers. Investigate, prosecute, and incarcerate the traffickers. The fourth is to seize the traffickers' assets. And the fifth is to reduce the demand for drugs, both through treatment and prevention, and by establishing intolerance to those who use illegal drugs. After having studied this strategy for the past 9 years while working for the House Judiciary Committee, I don't think any of the elements will work to eliminate the problems and harms surrounding illegal drug trafficking. To examine the effectiveness of the eradication of drug crops in source countries, I've traveled to Mexico and Peru, Bolivia, Jamaica, and Colombia with the House Select Committee on Narcotics. And in my sense, there is no way that we can prevent these crops from being grown. As the Senator pointed out, the peasants can get more money for these crops than for any other legal crop that they cultivate, and you can't beat that incentive. And the suggestion that perhaps we can tinker with the economic relationship slightly and make the cultivation of coffee or any legal crop more profitable than the cultivation of coca, I think reflects a failure to recognize that the price of the leaf is the smallest part in affecting the price in the United States. That the price of the leaf to the campesino could be doubled with almost no significant effect in changing the price of drugs in the United States and making them more expensive or scarcer. To send United States troops to South America is going to give communist insurgents an enormous propaganda advantage. It will destabilize friendly governments in the democratic process, and it will mimic the Vietnam debacle, the commencement of a war without an achievable strategy, without a clear enemy, and without an opportunity to win. Second element of the President's strategy is the interdiction of the drug supply line, and I suggest to you that that's simply impossible. Almost every day, almost 1 million people cross the borders to enter this country. That was 356 million people last year. 662,000 aircraft landed, and 218,000 vessels arrived last year from overseas. 3.2 billion pounds of cargo from airplanes and over 1 trillion pounds of shipborne cargo were unloaded from overseas in 1988. Only an infinitesimal amount of that can be inspected. Now consider that we import something like 200 metric tons of cocaine and 8 to 12 tons of heroin. That's less than 500,000 pounds compared to billions and trillions of pounds of legitimate cargo. Even bulky marijuana imports total less than 6.4 million pounds per year. Drugs are easily hidden in legitimate cargo, and there's no way we can interdict their supply into the United States. I have flown over the Mexican border in customs helicopters and over the Florida coast in Coast Guard aircraft. I've seen that we cannot seal our border. We will never be able to seize a significant percentage of the drugs that are coming in, even if you use the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. Now, you also have to look at the economics. The drugs become valuable once they're smuggled into the U.S. Take a metric ton of cocaine, just for example. Let's say that we seize that ton in Miami. It would be worth $35 million, perhaps, wholesale, if we got it to New York City, and perhaps $200 million or more when it's broken up into retail units. So the prosecutors hold a press conference and announce that cocaine with a value of $200 million has been seized today in Miami. But the cost of that ton of cocaine in Colombia was only $2 to $4 million. That's all it costs the traffickers. If the government seizes 5 one-ton shipments, that costs the smuggler a total of $10 to $20 million in losses. However, when the smuggler gets that 6th shipment in, he can gross $35 million in New York. That leaves him with a profit of between $15 and $25 million before expenses. Now, that example, of course, assumes a seizure rate of 80% against all smuggling attempts. But right now, the estimates are that only 10%, or at best 20% of the drugs headed for the United States are seized. What interdiction actually does is encourage the drug traffickers to raise their prices and to make more profit. And this is more harmful to all of us who are not involved in the drug business, because addicts will need more money to pay for overpriced drugs. The fourth element of the federal strategy is to incarcerate the traffickers. Right now, 40% of all the prisoners in all the federal prisons are drug traffickers. 40%. We are building prisons as fast as we can. The President wants to spend another $1 billion to construct 26,000 new federal prison cells. Yet the projections of federal prison population are that it may reach over 100,000 in the next 10 years, more than twice its current population, and most of them would be drug importers and drug sellers. Now, a school dropout here in Washington can make $1,000 per week selling drugs on the street. That's like a lawyer's wages. And we have, therefore, twice as many open-air drug markets in the D.C. area as we have supermarkets. And there's no way that we can arrest all the traffickers. The money is too good. I was called earlier this year by a very bright, college-educated 22-year-old from the Baltimore suburbs. He'd been arrested in Fort Lauderdale, Florida at the Amtrak station, carrying 2 kilos of cocaine. He thought he could make a quick, easy $20,000 on a trip from Florida to Baltimore. Well, he has been nailed. He couldn't cut a deal because no deal was possible under the Florida statute he was charged with violating. He got the mandatory prison term in the Florida penitentiary at Stark, 15 years with a toilet bowl next to his pillow. Now, he told me he didn't realize what the penalties were. Now, if an educated guy like him, who reads the newspapers, didn't know the penalties, then of what deterrent effect are they? If 15-year mandatory prison sentences are not deterring people who are literate, who read the newspapers, who watch television, who've got something to lose, then they aren't deterring anybody. It ought to be obvious that these minimum mandatory sentences cannot deter someone who feels he has nothing to lose, even if he is aware of the penalty. The last element, element number 4, is to seize the trafficker's assets. Thank you. DEA seized about $660 million in traffickers' assets last year, and may seize about $1 billion worth this year. That's far more than their budget, and DEA is very proud of those seizures. And they sound very impressive until you look behind them. Because the estimates are that the traffickers' profits are $100 billion last year. That's a seizure rate of less than 1% of the profits. That's a smaller bite than sales tax. For the traffickers, that's pocket change. Seizing the traffickers' assets is not going to take the profits out of the illegal drug business. Element number 5 is reducing demand for drugs. And everyone agrees that this is the long-term solution. Unfortunately, the Congress has not been willing to pay as much as it will take to reduce the demand for drug, in part because it's not sexy and in part because it's expensive. And it's not tough enough. The one element of the strategy that might work is the one that remains underfunded and politically unattractive. I should point out, by the way, that Senator Biden has been a leader in arguing that we need to spend more in these areas, but that he has not been able to convince the administration and the full Senate that the kinds of resources that are necessary ought to be spent. In the 1988 Drug Act, there was about $1.7 billion that was authorized for treatment and prevention and education. About $223 million of that was actually appropriated. And in the supplemental appropriation the President signed earlier this summer, there wasn't a nickel for the remaining $1.5 billion of treatment, prevention, and education that Congress promised solemnly 3 weeks before the election last year the American people were going to see. The latest twist on demand reduction is to convert it into a law enforcement program called user accountability. In 1986, Congress provided mandatory minimum penalties for simple possession of small amounts of drugs. In 1986, Congress provided for $10,000 civil penalties for possession of small amounts of drugs and directed the Attorney General to study alternatives to the criminal justice system. The Justice Department is touting the effort of the Phoenix, Arizona Police Chief Ruben Ortega, who has obtained the agreement of prosecutors and judges that they will jail all the drug possessors that they can catch. While I think it's still too early to report on the effectiveness of this effort, my hypothesis is that after all of the press releases, they will not be able to arrest enough people to make that threat of arrest credible to the 1.9 million people who live in the Phoenix area, considering that there are only 12,000 people in all of Arizona's prisons. Claiming to jail all drug users is not a tactic, it's a sales gimmick for a reverse lottery. The President's 5-part drug strategy, I believe, is doomed to fail. And as I conclude, let me pose this question. What do we expect the drug problem to look like 5 or 10 years from now if we keep on doing what we're doing? Will it look worse today or better? Will drug abuse be less harmful to society and individuals, or will it be more harmful? Now, we can reflect back in 1983 when then Vice President George Bush was named the head of the Vice President's South Florida Task Force on Drugs, and was going to be the drug czar of all of the federal efforts in Florida. Did we think then that we would have the crack cocaine crisis we have today and the soaring crime rates? Hardly. The anti-drug warriors of the Reagan administration promised us progress and delivered catastrophe. Who has a scenario that describes how the current drug policy is going to work at a price we can afford. I don't think anyone does. And I suggest it's time to fundamentally rethink our basic strategy for dealing with the problems of illegal drug trafficking with a clear goal in mind: to minimize the harms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I just perhaps also want to throw into the discussion a statistic that the Justice Department has, that the ABA study published with regard to the relevance of the criminal justice system with regard to crime generally. How good is our criminal justice system in protecting the public against crimes such as robbery, burglary, murder, rape? And the interesting statistic is that there are about 34 million serious felonies that harm Americans a year in this country, and of that 34 million, only 3 million ever get into the criminal justice system, which means that 31 million out of 34 million never see a cop, never see a prosecutor, never see a judge or a prison official. To that extent, we may be very irrelevant. And that's, by the way, law enforcement people doing everything they can with what resources they have. This is one of the stories that police and prosecutors tell us, that the public thinks that they really can protect them against crime when they can do very little, and it's kind of a frustrating job of failure. Let me call back Senator Biden in order to respond to Mr. Sterling and say anything else he wants to say.
Would it be all right if I just sit here and we both just sit here?
That's fine.
Let me suggest that Professor Dash just made a compelling argument. He just pointed out to you the criminal justice system doesn't work. It doesn't help with robbery or rape or murder. So it would follow that the same argument should be used as is used now with regard to legalization. Why have one? Why spend the money? Why do that? It's such a waste. The return on investment is so bad. We only have 3 million out of 36 million who ever meet any sort of justice. Ergo, let's make the legalization argument. It's a waste of money. Let's not do that, and let's legalize crime. At least we'll get revenues from it. We'll get fewer. I'm being a bit facetious, but seriously, think about it. Think about it. How is it any different to make the argument that because we only catch 3 or 1 in 12 of those who commit a felony in America, and by the way, it's probably higher because it's estimated that somewhere on the order of 50% of the felonies are not reported in America. All right? So because we only catch 1 in 12 on the reported number, or 1 in 24, therefore, why spend more money on police protection? It's not working. Let me make another point to you. If you notice, we talked a lot about legalization, but neither of us, at least I didn't get to the point, and I'm not sure my friend did. What are we legalizing? Are we going to legalize all forms of drugs? All forms? And what is the impact of that on the fundamental question here, reducing the harm to individuals? Let's talk about prohibition just for a minute and I'll stop. We hear all the time about what a great failure prohibition was. Well, prohibition was a failure in the sense that it attempted to go against somewhere around 1,000 to 2,000 years of Anglo-ethic regarding the consumption of alcohol. We do not have today in America but a scant number of people who have tried heroin or cocaine or any of the various combinations of the two drugs or any of the synthetic drugs. There is not such a tradition. But let's look at what the effects were of during Prohibition. Alcohol has, as I said, long been part of the lives of Americans in a tradition that mitigates against making it an offense. But the point is, let's look at specific things that happened during Prohibition. The Harvard criminologist Mark Moore has documented the following points. Alcohol consumption declined drastically by 30 to 50% during Prohibition. Sclerosis deaths for men decreased by 2/3 between 1911 and 29, and 29% for women. Incidence of alcohol psychosis dropped dramatically. Arrests for public drunkenness and disorderly dropped by 50%. from 1916 to 1922, and violent crime did not increase during Prohibition. That is malarkey. You are Al Caponeized. The fact of the matter is that homicide rates were roughly the same before Prohibition in Chicago and every other major city in America as they were during and after Prohibition. Organized crime units existed before and after Prohibition. Now, there may be social reasons for us not to have Prohibition, and I'm not suggesting Prohibition. But this notion that somehow, once we eliminated Prohibition, crime dropped and society benefited is malarkey. Now, the reason to do it is that the vast majority of our Judeo-Christian ethic indicated that alcohol was been and has been an acceptable part of human behavior, allegedly and hopefully, which it never is totally, moderated for 5,000 years. Drug consumption has not been. And I find it interesting for us to argue that merely because we have a substance, alcohol, that causes so many problems, we should therefore, or tobacco, which is addictive, we should therefore legalize other addictive things. Rather than argue, because we have two addictive substances that everyone acknowledges does harm on balance to society and individuals, maybe we shouldn't add another to the category. Now, let me close by saying, because there's too much more to say, and I don't want to monopolize this and give you a chance, give my friend a chance to rebut and you to ask questions. Let's assume for the moment we concede the point. Let's go out and legalize. I would like to know, mechanically, how do you do that? Do we have state drug stores like we have state liquor stores? Is private enterprise allowed to engage like we have now? Or can you walk in and buy over-the-counter any substance that you wish? And does anyone here suggest that during the period of ingestion of a significant number of the drugs that are on the street today, that the person who has ingested them does not lose total control of their ability to make rational judgments, and that psychosis and violence does not flow from the mere consumption? Individuals, let mothers consume, make it legal when everyone acknowledges it will increase consumption. Let mothers be able to go buy over-the-counter cocaine or parachutes or ice or any other form of legal drug and see what happens to child abuse in America. Tell me what happens to individuals then. I promise you we will have a new measure by which we determine whether society is harmed. And tell me, how many people can tell me there is anyone who has consumed more than on 2 occasions crack or methamphetamine crank and has not become psychologically addicted to it? I'd like to hear it, because I have questioned every one of the leaders that I've been told, from NIH straight through to the research folks in academia, who tell me that with normal individuals, it is almost certainly addictive. Now, it seems to me there's a separate set of problems, but I'll end by asking the question, how do we mechanically do this good thing that's going to take violence off the streets? How do we mechanically do this thing that's going to allow the mechanism by which we allow the dispensing of these drugs? And how do we keep the price so low that I think we all have to acknowledge it'd have to be somewhere now under $10 a gram for cocaine, that we don't generate a black market, the very thing we're attempting to avoid? There may be answers. I've never been heard satisfactory answers.
Good set of questions, Senator. Sterling, do you want to, is that something you want to attack, or do you want to discuss something else?
I think that I have to answer the Senator's questions. It seems to me that he goes to really the heart of the matter. the first thing I think is that there is no magic solution, and I think I can sort of approach it one way. When I brought this up with one of the leading Democratic pollsters and sort of trying to get some advice about how to present this issue, I laid out my particular scheme. He said, this reminds me of Bob Newhart's very famous comedy bit where Abner Doubleday is explaining to some reporters how baseball works. And the reporter is saying, now wait a minute, 3 balls and 4 strikes? Now why 3 balls and 4 strikes? And you're going to have, after you have 2 strikes that are foul balls, then you can have an unlimited number of foul balls? That doesn't make any sense. Mr. Doubleday, I don't know what you're talking about. 9 men on a team? 9 innings? Why not 10? 10's a nice number. When I proposed this, I think that was his reaction. I think many people have the same reaction. And I have what I call the stockbroker model. And those of you who are studying securities law know that somebody walks into a securities broker and says, hey, my Aunt Matilda just died. I'd like to put the $50,000 she left me down on pork belly options on the Chicago Commodities Exchange, deliverable next June. And the broker's never seen this guy before. The guy walks in, wait a minute. Mr. Sterling, do you have any life insurance? Do you own a house, Mr. Sterling? What's your investment strategy? Well, depends. Do you know anything about this? He said, hell, Attorney General William Fred Smith, he made a fortune in one of these butterfly tax straddle deals. I want to make a fortune too. And the stockbroker would say, you can throw your money away in Atlantic City or Las Vegas, but I can't do it legally and ethically. I have to be satisfied that you are competent to buy this particular security that you're asking me to buy. Now, what I envision is a...
Can I interrupt you there?
Sure.
You know how many stockbrokers would ask that question, don't you? In the real world.
I don't have a stockbroker, so I don't know in the real world.
I don't either, but I investigate them, and I know why I'm investigating them.
What I envision would be a consulting pharmacist. Pharmacists are trained in the effects of drugs on people. And one of the greatest of our wasted talent in our society are pharmacists who have an enormous amount of training and end up behind the counter at people's drugs, pouring pills into bottles and typing out the names of people and doctors and how many milligrams. They have an enormous amount of expertise which can be shared. And what I would envision, and I realize there are an enormous number of flaws in this example, and it sounds bureaucratic as heck, that a person who wants to get drugs, whether it's PCP or cocaine or heroin or whatever, would go to a consulting pharmacist and say, this is what I'm interested in using this particular drug for. These are the drugs that I use, and this is how I use drugs, and this is how I think it's going to help my life. What do you think, Doc? And Doc would say, well, you say you want to use cocaine to improve your sex life. Well, have you ever used marijuana? No, I never have. All I know is about what I hear on television. Or, well, how much... the question is what kind of advice and what ways do we intervene? What kind of ways do we intervene with people to give them useful advice in this kind of context? Now, when I explain it, I can understand why a lot of people have the sort of Abner Doubleday before the reporter's kind of response. Sterling, what are you talking about? Is that people in the ghetto? Are they going to go to all this trouble? And yet I think about poor people in our society who are among the most regulated people in this society. They know how to deal with the food stamp program. They know how to deal with public assistance. They know how to deal with the public housing bureaucracy. And they know how to deal with bureaucracy better than any of us. The suggestion somehow, drug users, they'll never use the bureaucracy. I don't know. The question is, sometimes it's like Winston Churchill's observation about democracy. It's a terrible system, but it's the best one we've got. And in some sense, we're left with that same situation in looking with drugs. Do we have the best system now, even though it's terrible? Or can we come up with a better system?
Let's now go to you and see whether you like that kind of a solution and whether it's even workable, or what would you want to talk about and who do you want to ask your question? Anybody, and I'll call on you. Yes. Would you stand up? and speak loudly enough so we can hear your question.
Mr. Sterling, if we take Senator Biden's words true that people that use drugs are not rational and can't deal with people, I would be very afraid to be a consulting pharmacist if someone who already uses drugs is going to come and ask me advice and might have a gun or a knife or 6 friends outside with guns and knives to ask me advice. I don't think you're going to get anyone to volunteer to be a consulting pharmacist working with people who are acknowledged addicts. I don't think it will work.
Well, you raise an excellent point, and the difficulty is how do we translate our current experience of what drug addiction is, completely dominated by criminality, in which drug addicts are, acknowledged to be the scum of the earth, and try to imagine what a legal, regulated system is. Because in a place like Britain, where heroin use has never been illegal, the addicts don't necessarily walk around with guns and knives. The reason the addicts walk around with guns and knives is because they are told they're felons from the time they get up in the morning and shoot up. I mean, they're felons because all the felonies you could dream up to prosecute them for are nothing like the felony of the fact that they're a heroin addict. I mean, the same argument also points out we don't have any psychiatrists who treat people with sexual disorders. We don't have people who treat people because we could never deal with them. There is, I believe, an enormous mythology and exaggeration about who the addicts are. I mean, there was a lawyer on the staff of Senator Moynihan's staff who was arrested buying heroin over on the New York Avenue at a motel. I mean, guy who goes to work, wears a suit and tie, just like the senator and myself, walks around the halls of the Congress, the heroin addict. There are, over at the federal courthouse, there are Narcotics Anonymous programs. You can go in there and you can meet addicts. Talk to them, find out, what are these people like? They're not demons.
Can I briefly respond to that?
Certainly.
I want to make it clear, I was not trying to in any way ridicule what the approach is. My disagreement with Mr. Sterling and others, when you get right down to implementation, does not relate to the fact that you cannot conceive of a system that theoretically would work. It's that I think I and you know human nature. And human nature is such that in every other endeavor we have ever undertaken that I can think of, without a single exception, when you have someone selling something across the counter for a profit, they in fact are not inclined, whether or not they're the bartender who is required by law not to give you that last drink when he or she thinks you are becoming intoxicated, whether or not it is the stockbroker who is required by law not to advise you or let you do certain things, or whether or not it is the person who will be selling to a mass of, probably, somewhere in excess of 24 or 25 million people consuming drugs. At the height, 3 years ago, 24 million Americans said at least one time or another they consumed an illegal drug during that year. And so how do you mechanically do that? And the notion that somebody 18 years old is going to come in, or 14 with a false ID card, or 15 or 30, and say, now, here's why I want to try the following drug. And by the way, if you want your sexual proficiency to increase, there's only one drug that medical science and NIDA they've indicated works. They don't know why. It's an awful thing to acknowledge. That's why it's going to beat out crack shortly. It's crank, methamphetamine. Seriously. It is a medical fact.
And that's a crime now?
Not a crime. not a crime. All I'm suggesting is go to the right pharmacist if that's what you're looking for. And the last point I'll make is the notion of what causes criminal behavior once consuming. If you take an opiate, you are much less likely to engage in criminal activity if the opiate is legal, heroin. But if you take a stimulant like cocaine or any other stimulant, you are not capable of being in control of your functions, your mind, and you are inclined to aberrant behavior and paranoia. That is a medical fact. And it doesn't come from learning how to consume liquor over a period of 3 years. It comes over a matter of days. Doesn't mean you're addicted, but it does mean when you are under the influence of crank or crack, you are in fact subject to aberrant behavior that is proactive. And the reason why people do crazy things then is because they say, my friend who taps me on the shoulder was about to strangle me, so I shot him, or I hit him on the head. It's not quite the same as alcohol, which is a sedative for most people. Different deaths, different crimes occur, but not the proactive nature of people who consume those drugs.
I've been to plenty of bars where they don't let 14-year-olds in. They put you in a car when you drink too much. I doubt there's many craft houses like that. But I was wondering, in the next 5 years, what kind of impact do you want to have on the drug program? You would say that was a victory. And what kind of impact do you have, and you would say that that was failure? I
think that's a valid question. Let me answer it very, very briefly. And I was kind of Mr. Sterling to point out that I never have been one, ever, who has said this is a war on drugs. And I have never have been one, and those of you who have had to follow this issue and have had to listen to me on this issue have argued strenuously against the assertion that we're going to end drug consumption. That is bizarre. That is preposterous. It is not going to happen any more than we're going to end any other deviant behavior at all, number one. Number two, the measure of success for me will be if, in fact, we can reasonably measure, and I have put forward an actual figure, a 10% decrease in the number of those who are measured as addictive 5 years from today. If, in fact, we have increased drug education beginning in kindergarten and alcohol education from kindergarten on, so that by 5 years from now it is in place in every school in America. If, in fact, we are in a position where 5 years from now we are able to measure the number of casual users as having declined at the same average at a minimum, which is about 9% per year for the past 4 years. That, to me, will be a beginning. And the last point is, it took us a generation to get here. We have had other drug epidemics in this country. We used to have cocaine dens in this country. In 1912, and then immediately after the war, because of all those who were gassed, heroin became a big problem. These run in cycles. I don't want to institutionalize a cycle. That's my problem with legalization.
Back there.
There's been legalization of some drugs in the Netherlands, for instance. I was wondering if you could comment on exactly what drugs are legalized there, what the effect is, that effort has been.
Fine. In fact, there is no legalization of drugs in the Netherlands. The Dutch policy is what they call prosecutorial discretion. The current drug statutes in the Netherlands prohibit all of the drugs that we think of as illegal from being sold legally. However, notwithstanding that, they make cannabis available to youth in youth clubs that the government runs in the big cities. If you're over age 16, you can buy beer and you can buy cannabis in youth clubs. The Dutch are very happy with that approach because they feel that they've made cannabis use very boring, that their rate of daily cannabis use among 18-year-olds is about 1/10 it was in the United States a number of years ago. Daily marijuana use in the United States has gone down dramatically. I don't know what the current comparison is. With respect to heroin and cocaine, those drugs are not legal. The most severe penalties in Dutch law for offenses are those of selling heroin and cocaine, and the Dutch police work as hard as they can to prosecute them. But they don't harass the users. They don't go after the prostitutes. They don't go after the addicts. They make needles available to the addicts to cut down on the chance that AIDS will be spread from addict to addict. They have buses that carry methadone around to the community. Instead of trying to make it a difficult problem to hassle addicts, methadone is readily available to addicts by bus. Their approach is what they call, in their terms, also harm minimization. And they are very excited with the way that they feel their policy works. Most of the problems that they see are people from other countries who are not Dutch who come to the Netherlands thinking that it's a mecca for drug use.
Back row over there.
I have a question for both the Senator and Mr. Studd. Senator, you first. In my opinion, I think the reason why many people are talking about legalization is because there is no policy or effective policy either from Congress, no leadership, or from the president. So we have to look at all alternatives. My question to you then is, knowing what you know about alcohol and its effect, deaths and all that is involved with alcohol and cocaine as you know today, why is it that we have a legalization of alcohol and you don't think it's necessary to consider legalizing cocaine, knowing what you know? Mr. Sterling, your question is this. After we legalize cocaine, what then? What's next? Because we are not going to, I don't see any legislation prohibiting chemistry. So scientists will always come up with formulas that will make up another drug. What then? Where do we go from here? Do we find another drug and then legalize that and go on and on from there? Or do we just stop at marijuana and cocaine? That's it.
I almost forget my question. No.
I think the question really was if we can legalize alcohol, why can't we legalize cocaine? And then how do we stop?
I know. I was being facetious. I won't do that again in the interest of time. I thought I had answered the question when I pointed out that there are certain things that are part of a culture and a tradition that have been inculcated in that culture and tradition for thousands of years. And it is run...
I do understand that there is an Anglo culture involved, but that does not explain the deaths that involve alcohol. People die every day.
No,
so we can't use culture to...
Let the senator answer your question.
The answer to the question is, the way you cannot practically deal with that inculcated tradition that's been around for thousands of years. Now, the way to deal with it is the way we're beginning to deal with it and have an effect. And that is, say, you can use, but if you abuse, you pay a serious price and a serious penalty. And thirdly, that you significantly increase the amount of treatment available for those who are abusing and cannot stop without them having to bankrupt themselves in order to be able to get help. They're the three pieces when you have with legalization. But to counter and say because that is legal, albeit harmful, you should make something else that we acknowledge is harmful to individuals legal also, is to me it does not follow. And again, in terms of the Netherlands, in fairness to the argument made by Mr. Sterling, the folks I've spoken to in the Netherlands, the government officials, they argue one step further. They say that the reason by making marijuana available and legal, they believe that's been part of the reason why they have had a decrease in the consumption of heroin and cocaine. But Italy legalizes heroin, and they are in the disastrous straits, and every one of their officials acknowledges it. It's been a total failure from their position, which is another question. But anyway.
You had a question there?
Excuse me, Professor, I think there was a question addressed to me.
Yeah.
Yes, both of you.
Thank you. In fact, there is continual research going on in chemicals that are mind-altering. The buzzword a few years ago was called designer drugs. And the Congress, to deal with this problem, said that we're going to make it a crime for anybody to design a new chemical which might have effects similar to an existing prohibited drug, or which chemically may look like an existing drug. The obvious question is, what would the effects of such drugs be? We have developed synthetic narcotics called fentanyl, and there are fentanyl analogs, sufentanil, alpha fentanyl, and so on, drugs which are 1,000 times more potent than morphine, 3,000 times more potent than morphine. Fentanyl is used widely in surgery now, and drug companies are working on developing new drugs for pain relief. My sense is that people have a right to use drugs, that any drug, that your nervous system is yours. It's not interstate commerce. That there is no power in the Constitution that authorizes the Congress to say that it can tell you that you cannot control yourself. If your behavior if you harm someone, if you drive recklessly, that behavior is punishable and prosecutable. But just as when the senator made the point that there is a change in the chemistry of the brain, it happens that there's a change in the chemistry of all of your brains as you've been sitting here listening to us. And when you leave here, and to the extent you remember what we've said, your brain has been permanently chemically changed. Permanently.
I apologize for doing that to you.
I don't.
Hey, I've got to make one point here. Look, we're now down to the nub of it. The nub of the argument is, and the most compelling argument for legalization, is that it's your body, it's your mind. That's really what this is all about. So let's cut through it all. It's your body, it's your mind, if in fact you believe that you have a right to do with your body as you wish and only worry about the consequences of what your actions, whether or not you're punished, then we should not have any prescription drugs. We should not have any of those things. Period.
I just want to add, I think that may oversimplify the issue, and I'm not sure you're addressing that, Ms. Sterling, that the question frequently is raised as to whether or not the harm done by criminalization is even more than the harm done by decriminalization. It seems to me when the police and prosecutors raise that issue, and when the issue is presented that way by the mayor of Baltimore, I don't think he puts it on the basis that we have a right to do to our bodies what we want. He puts it on the basis that criminalization has caused more harm to society than decriminalization could possibly. Now, I think that may not be a valid argument, but that's the issue.
Now, we've been debating that issue. And I think that is not a valid argument, and I hope we're going to debate it some more. But the point I'm making is the real fundamental argument that underlies most of the people who are pushing for this issue, on this issue, is the fundamental question of the right to control your own body. And if you adopt that philosophy, those of you who are thinking about that, then there is no rationale for any of the proscriptions against consumption of anything. That's all the only point I want to make. And you and I can argue, this is a good argument. It goes both ways. You and I can argue the other case.
Okay, yes.
I'm a Colombian, and I would like to ask both of you that although you touched the Colombian problem,
Speak louder.
you never said what would be the consequence of legalizing the drugs in Colombia. We have to have in mind that the problem is a little bit different because although we have consumption, the biggest problem we are having is the corruption and the murders of all our people in the exploitation of our institutions. I think this is a multinational problem. It's not only the problem of the United States. I think if you both are looking at the consequence, positive or negative consequence of the problem, I think you should have in mind that we have to pay a little bit, a very big cost, high cost, and you have never talked nothing about this problem in legalization.
It seems to me that there isn't any question that the Colombian people right now in their government are suffering more from the illegal market in drugs than any society. And it seems to me that that's an inevitable result of the economic structure that we find ourselves in. That when you set up a particular commodity that is the most valuable commodity in an economy, and you say, you criminals, you run that commodity, you run that business, they will become the most powerful people in the society. And you end up with the choice that the Colombians now face, ruled by gangsters or martial law to fight the gangsters. And that is essentially the choice that we will face in the United States in 5 or 10 years. That the criminals are making tax-free $100 billion a year in profits in the United States. And after they bought their last condominium in Palm Beach, they're going to start buying judges and prosecutors and legislators, as well as...
Did you just say start buying?
Hey, wait a minute. Let's stop right there. That is not... There is no evidence.
No.
There is no evidence.
Of corruption?
Of corruption on any scale in the federal system or in the state system on drugs. There is no evidence. Let me say it again, and I'd like to see it. Not say it, see it. There may be an occasional judge that you may find has gone bad, like the one we just ended up impeaching. But I want to emphasize it again. No evidence, no allegation that I have heard. And when the reason why Colombians don't want to be extradited here, by their own testimony, including to the Turn State's evidence, is, quote, we can't buy American judges. That's the reason why they don't want to be extradited and tried here. So we can be flip, but let's make sure we're accurate. There is no evidence. If there is any, I want to see it. The strongest argument for legalization is your country. That's the strongest argument. Mr. Sterling's case is strongest for you, because if in fact we do legalize, it means that the profit will be taken out at the front end in a big way, arguably. But the flip side of it is, when I met with your president, and I met with a number of your officials, including your ambassador, for 2 hours a day, Thursday, you know what they're telling me, which you already know? They're not only now worried about the criminal element and the impact it has on ruining the oldest democracy in this hemisphere, they are worried that now consumption and addiction to cocaine is becoming so widespread in your country that you're getting it at both ends. But the strongest argument, to the extent one can be made, I would concede, relates to your country more than our country.
There's a question back there.
I just have a question for Mr. Sterling. You seem to have indicated that if you change the label, you change the behavior. And that really was disconcerting to me, that if you said that the heroin addict's woken up for 10 years and being called a felon. So if we wake up tomorrow and we call him a consumer, all of a sudden he's no longer going to exhibit the same behaviors. Wait, I just want to finish my question, please, and I'll allow you to continue. We talked about the rational actor here. You're saying that people have the right to make a decision whether or not to buy drugs. The American Medical Association happens to label alcoholism as an obsessive compulsive disorder. And experts have elucidated on the fact that there are usually 3 ways out of addiction. One is death, one is incarceration, and the other is recovery. We've talked about how we can bring the value added to this country. Your argument's been economical at certain points. You talked about insurance. You made the point that the criminal insurance element and what that's costing us. What about I have several, my question to you is sort of encompassing. A, insurance. You look at it in a very limited perspective. What about the overwhelming burden on insurance carriers right at this particular moment on dealing with recovery issues? The cost of having someone in a 28-day program is approximately $5,000. What about the loss to the American economical unit in terms of lost work hours? We see already that alcoholism is perhaps the 3rd major cause of death in this country due to auto accidents, sclerosis. Now, I find it very disconcerting that you're willing to bring into another element under the basis of A, the rational actor, B, the economic argument. And Senator, I'd like to thank you for educating yourself on this issue and for being so well versed on it and taking a stand on it.
I got a hell of a lot more to learn.
Yeah, but let's get a answer to the question.
With respect to changing a label and thinking there's going to be instantaneous change, I don't think that that's the case. I don't think there's any magical solution. I mean, a lot of the people who are drug addicts are really very pathetic people. But that's not to say that all of them are. And that our stereotypes about them do tend to blind us to what the reality is. I share your concern about alcoholism. I'm horrified by the way our society promotes its use. I mean, remember that a character like Spuds MacKenzie is not designed to get any of us to buy beer. It's designed to get children to buy beer. When we should not have the promotion of alcohol toward children, I would support measures that would prohibit the advertising of alcohol and tobacco. I mean, gross things like the Camel cigarette smooth character type ad cartoons to try to get children to start using tobacco, those offend me. I think that those promotions of drug use should not be allowed. And I part company with libertarians and civil libertarians in that area. I would prohibit the advertising of alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, and so on. I would also ban cigarette vending machines. I'm curious why we don't see more prosecutions for people selling cigarettes to children, when we know that 90% of all cigarette smokers start before they're 21, and 60% of them start before they're 14. I would see much greater penalties for selling alcohol to children. I want to see the age distinctions strengthened in terms of the use of drugs. In terms of the question of insurance and the enormous cost that recovery makes, you're right about recovery. That is the question. And when you talk to addicts now, and you realize how despondent they are because they are criminals in their addiction, because they are harassed by the police. Think about the difference between the alcoholic and the heroin addict. The alcoholic does not have to worry about being prosecuted, doesn't have to worry about AIDS. I mean, he just has to worry about his addiction. The addict is in a completely different situation, and we're not making the addict's life any better or helping the addict recover anymore by beating down his self-esteem and sending him to prison. Prison is not a good place to learn self-esteem. And yet that's what we sentence the thousands of addicts to, is prison as an alternative.
If we have time later, I'd like to respond to that.
You can respond now. We have the time.
I don't know. I was a public defender for a while, and
I knew there was another reason why I liked you.
And I'm not crazy about prosecutors. And I like you, Mr. Dash. But you know, there are a couple reasons why people use drugs. I gathered together, and I'd be happy to anybody interested to submit the list of the people who are the leading proponents of legalization in the scientific community, as well as those who oppose it, the so-called experts. And I asked one question at the beginning of this year to try to educate myself more. It sounds like a dumb question. Why do people take drugs in the first place? Well, believe it or not, there's hardly any empirical evidence. Few studies done as to why people take drugs. We're just starting to do that now. And a couple things come across. One, the people who tend to take drugs when they're young, there's a certain pattern to them. They tend to be risk takers. The same kid who's not afraid to get home late with his sneakers muddy for his mom, it's the same kid who's most likely going to try something that his buddy says, hey, try it. Whether you're 2, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, whatever. People take it because it feels good. And people take them because they think they want to try something new. But there's a second question. Why do people keep taking drugs, those who do? In most all cases, it's because they have a relatively low self-esteem and their self-image is not very much intact. That's usually why. I'm sure there's exceptions. And just think from your own experience. Those suited lawyers who go for methadone, those people you know in your own family or other families who have a drug problem are not junkies out in the street laying in a gutter. All those who you know who consume drugs on a regular or even an irregular basis, ask yourself from your own experience, how happy do you think they are with themselves? What is their self-esteem, their self-image? And so when you get down to the root of this thing, you get to the question of what the notion of recovery has to do with criminalization. I don't know any alcoholic, and unfortunately in my family I know alcoholics.